Hello and welcome back, ShriKe here with another D&D video. Today I'm going to talk you through how combat works in 5th edition Dungeons & Dragons. Arguably, combat is the hardest thing to get your head around when you're looking at the rules of Dungeons & Dragons. So I'm going to put together this complete guide, so by the end of this video, you should completely understand combat in Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition. But before that, I just want to let you know that I upload Dungeons & Dragons content here on YouTube every Monday and Thursday, so please hit the subscribe button if you want to see more Dungeons & Dragons content, and make sure to hit the notification bell just next to it so that you get notified when I upload a new video. Now you can just go and read the combat section of the player's handbook and then you'll have an understanding of combat, but I'm hoping that in this video I can use examples and I can actually show you on a grid how it will work. There are also some areas where players will commonly get confused, so I will go through those areas and I will word it in a different way than the player's handbook, so you should understand it. But if you do get to the end of the video and there's anything you're still not sure about, make sure to just put them down in the comments and I'll help you out. So we are going to start off by talking about how combat actually starts. So the first thing that you have to take into consideration is if anyone is surprised, so if they don't know they're about to be attacked. If your party and the enemies just come into conflict and there's no one being surprised, then you don't have to worry about this next step. But if, for example, the rogue wants to sneak up on the goblin and wants to attack it before any sort of combat has started, then you have to determine if that goblin is surprised or not. And to do that, you would get the rogue to do a stealth check and then use the goblin's passive perception to determine if they see the rogue or not. So if the rogue rolled an 18 and the goblin's passive perception was only 12, then the rogue would succeed on the stealth attack. That means that the rogue will have advantage on the attack, which we'll get onto later. But if there's more than just a rogue and the goblin in this encounter, you have to do this for every single enemy that might be surprised and see how many of them are actually surprised. Once you have determined who is surprised and who is not surprised, you have to roll initiative. On a player's character sheet, there will be a little initiative box which will have the number in it, and you roll your d20 and you add that number, and then that is your initiative roll. But if you're the DM and you're rolling initiative for the monsters, for the enemies, then on the monster block, you just take their dexterity. Once all of the players have rolled initiative and all of the monsters for the Dungeon Master have rolled initiative, they are ordered, and that is the order that people can act. And then the Dungeon Master will just go down the initiative, and when it is the player's turn they will let them know, and when it's a monster's turn they will do whatever they will need to do with their monster. On a player's turn there are 3 different things you can do. One is your movement, one is your action, and one is your bonus action. They're also what are called free actions, but they are usually incorporated in either your movement action or bonus action. Not every player gets their bonus action every single round. It is determined if you have an ability or a spell that uses a bonus action, but if you don't, you just don't have the bonus action for that round. So let's start with movement. Most characters start with 30 feet of movement, but in character creation it might differ depending on your race or any other abilities that you get. If you're playing on a grid, then each grid space is equal to 5 feet. So if you do have 30 feet of movement, that means that you can move 6 squares. You also don't have to use all of your movement in one go. You can use part of it, then use your action, and then use the rest of it. So with this example on your screen now, you can see that there is a map with a grid, and the player is going to move 15 feet, take a shot with their bow and arrow, and then move another 15 feet to the cover on the other side. Some environments will slow you down, such as heavy snow or undergrowth. If this is the case, then every foot of movement costs an extra foot. So if you have 30 feet of movement and you're going through snow, you can actually only move 15 feet. There are abilities and spells which also create difficult terrain. You can also go prone in your movement, which is lying on the ground. If you're going from standing to lying on the ground, it doesn't cost any of your movement, but if you're going from lying on the ground up to standing, that costs half of your movement. So if you have 30 feet of movement, it costs 15 feet of movement to get back up to standing. But if you don't have that 15 foot of movement left, you can't get back up from prone until next turn. You can crawl while you are in the prone position, but every foot of movement when you do that costs an additional foot of movement. So if you're crawling through difficult terrain, that means that 1 foot of movement actually costs you 3 feet of movement. So your 30 foot speed turns to 10 feet. You can move through a creature space if they are non-hostile to you, or if they are 2 sizes larger or 2 sizes smaller than you. But moving through a creature's space does count as difficult terrain. And in no circumstance can you end your turn in a creature's space. You have to end your turn in an unoccupied space. When I say a creature that is 2 sizes larger or 2 sizes smaller than you, look at this table and it should make sense. So a human is a medium-sized creature, which means that they fit in a 5 by 5 foot space, which on a grid is 1 square. Whereas a large creature fits in a 10 by 10 foot space, which is 4 squares on a grid. That means that because the human is a medium creature, they can move through the space of a tiny creature, a huge creature, but they cannot move through the space of a small or a large creature. Humans are obviously not actually 5 foot wide, this is just a representation of the space that they control while in combat. A creature can also squeeze through a space which is 1 size smaller than they are. But to do that, they have to use 1 foot of extra movement for every 1 foot of movement that they use. And while they're in that smaller space, they have disadvantage on dexterity saving throws and attack rolls. Advantage and disadvantage is something we're going to get into later in the video. So that pretty much goes through everything you can do with movement in combat, so hopefully you have a better understanding of that part as we go into how to use your action in combat. So with your action in combat, you can attack, you can cast a spell, you can disengage, you can dash, you can help, you can search, you can hide, you can ready an action, and you can use an object. We're going to go into more details of how to do an attack and how to cast a spell later on in the video, so let's go through the rest first. So starting with dash, that means that you can use your action to move even further. So if your movement is 30 feet, you can use your movement to move 30 feet, and then you can use your action to move another 30 feet. And everything like difficult terrain and stuff like that also applies to your dash action while you're moving. If you take the disengage option, that means that if you move out of an enemy's range, you don't provoke an attack of opportunity. An attack of opportunity happens whenever a creature leaves a hostile creature's range. That hostile creature then gets the opportunity to take an attack on you as you're moving on away. But if you take the disengage option, they don't get that opportunity of attack. If you take the dodge action, that means that if an attacker that you can see makes an attack on you, they have disadvantage on that roll. It also means that if you make a dexterity saving throw at any point, you do it with advantage. You are unable to dodge if you are incapacitated or if you have a speed of 0. If you take the help action, that means that you can help an ally with their next ability check or attack. This would give your ally advantage. For example, if an ally was trying to inspect a chest to work out how to get into it, you could help them, giving them advantage on their investigation roll. Alternatively, you could give your ally advantage on their next attack roll by getting in the enemy's face and by distracting them. If you take the search action, then you devote your entire action to trying to find something. The Dungeon Master might have you do a perception or an investigation check if it's required. Some objects require you to use an action to use them. This is quite common with magical items, and it will say it in the text of the magical item. You can ready an action, which means that you decide an action you would like to do out of all of the ones that we've spoken about so far, and the attack action and casting a spell action that we're going to come on to next. And then you decide a trigger for when you will let that action release. For example, I might choose the action of taking a shot with my bow and arrow at the goblin, and then make the trigger that if I can see the goblin. This is good to use if someone's hiding, because then you can keep your bow and arrow knocked, and then when the goblin comes visible, you can attack them. If you used a readied action to cast a spell, it does use the spell slot even if you don't actually end up using the spell. To release your action, you do also have to use what is called your reaction, which we will come into later in the video. So now let's talk about making an attack. There are 2 parts to making an attack, the first of which is called the attack roll, and then the second of which is called the damage roll. You first have to roll the attack roll to see if you actually hit the target, and then if you do hit the target, you have to roll the damage roll to see how much damage you do to them. So let's first talk about the attack roll. On a player's character sheet, just next to their weapon, you'll see that there is an attack bonus. To roll an attack roll, all you have to do is roll your d20 and then plus your attack bonus, and that will give you your attack roll. And then the hostile creature will have what is called an armor class, or an AC. If your attack roll equals or exceeds their armor class, that means that you succeed in hitting them. This is the exact same way the other way around as well, and you have your own armor class on your character sheet. So when the Dungeon Master says that the attack roll of the enemy is so much, you have to look at your armor class, and then if it equals or succeeds your armor class, they do hit you. There are 2 things that might change your attack roll, and that's if you roll a 1 or roll a 20 on the d20. If you roll a 1, you automatically miss, but if you roll a 20, that means you get a critical hit, which we will explain a little bit later. There are some things in combat that will make your attack roll have either advantage or disadvantage. If you have advantage on your attack roll, that means that you roll 2 d20s and then you take the higher one. So for example, if you roll 2d20s, one has a 15 and one has a 5, you ignore the one with a 5 and you just use the one with the 15 and add your modifier to that, and then that is your attack roll. On the other hand, if you have disadvantage, you roll 2d20s and then you take the lower one. So in the same example, if you roll 2d20s and you get a 15 and a 5, you would ignore the 15 and you would take the 5 and then add your modifier to that, and then that is your attack roll. Something that might cause you to have disadvantage on your attack roll is if you cannot see the creature you're trying to attack, if they've cast something like invisibility on them. But then on the other hand, you would have advantage if they can't see you. If you're using a ranged weapon like a longbow, it has a range next to it with 2 numbers next to that. The first number is how far you can shoot without any penalty, and then the second number is how far you can shoot with disadvantage. There are some weapons like the hand axe which have the thrown property, which means that you can hit your enemies at melee distance, or you can throw it at range. But if you are using a weapon like a longbow that doesn't have the thrown property, and there's an enemy within 5 feet of you, you have disadvantage on the attack. If you're doing a melee attack, then you can only attack creatures within your range, which is usually 5 feet, but some monsters and some weapons have a range of 10 feet or higher. This is where we come on to opportunity attacks and reactions, which we've spoken about earlier. So if you look at this example now on your screen, the player is engaged within 5 feet with an enemy. The enemy has a reach of 5 foot, so if the player moves out of its reach, that means the enemy gets an opportunity attack. This means that they perform an attack roll to see if they hit, and then they would do the damage, which we're going to speak about a bit later. Now in order to do this, the creature would have to use their reaction, which is a different type of action that you can only use outside of your own turn. And you only get 1 reaction per round of combat. So if there were 2 players within 5 feet of that creature and one moved away and they took an opportunity attack at that one, the second one, when they move away, would not have an opportunity attack against them. Now let's talk about how you actually deal damage to someone. So once you've done your attack roll and you've determined that you will hit the creature, you have to do your damage roll. Different weapons have different damage dice and their abilities and spells which increase the amount of damage dice you do when you attack. Before a basic attack, you will see the weapon's damage dice and then you will have your modifier. All you do to determine how much damage you do is you roll the dice and then you plus your modifier. This damage is then taken off of the hit points of the enemy that you're attacking. And on the flip side, if you're being attacked and they've attacked you, the Dungeon Master will tell you how much damage you take and you have to subtract that from your hit points. Earlier I said that if you roll a natural 20 on your attack roll, you get a critical hit. Well, here is where it's important. Because if you've hit a critical hit, that means you double the amount of dice you roll for the damage. So if your damage is 1d8 plus 4, you actually roll 2d8 plus 4 and then take the total. Now if you reduce an enemy's hit points to 0, that means they're dead, but you do have the option to incapacitate them rather than just outright kill them. But you should tell the Dungeon Master that that's your intention before you even do your attack roll. If you as the player are reduced to 0 hit points, it is a little bit different because you have to start rolling what are called death saving throws. So if your turn comes round in combat and you're at 0 hit points, you have to do a death saving throw, which means you roll a d20 and if it's 10 or higher, it's counted as a success, but if it's 9 or lower, it is counted as failure. There's no sort of modifiers that go to it, it's just a straight roll. And then if you get to 3 failures, you are dead, your character is no more. But if you get to 3 successes, that means you're stabilised, and although you're not back up and fighting, that means that you're not dead, which, pretty good. If on your death saving throw you roll a 1, that means that you get 2 failures instead of the 1. But if you roll a 20, that means that you come back to consciousness with 1 hit point. If you take any sort of damage while you're at 0 hit points, you automatically get a death saving throw. And if you take a critical hit while you're at 0 hit points, that means you take 2 death saving throws. You can get things like potions and there are spells which give you hit points, and if that happens, all you have to do is add the hit points back onto your character. You can't get healed any higher than your maximum hit points. And if you were at 0 hit points and you get healed back up and then you get knocked down again to 0 hit points, you start from scratch. Whatever successes and failures you had before don't carry over. There are also abilities and spells which give temporary hit points. These aren't hit points that add to your main pool of hit points, they are a separate pool of hit points on the side. I like to think of them as having an external shield which is taking some of the damage. But once that shield is gone, it's gone and then you start getting hit again. So let's now talk about casting spells in combat. Every spell will have a casting time, a range, and a duration. The casting time will be what type of action that you have to use to actually cast a spell, such as 1 action, 1 bonus action, or 1 reaction. The range is how far in feet you can cast the spell. and the duration is how long the spell lasts for. When we're talking about spells that deal damage, there are two types. One that requires you to do a spell attack roll, and another one that requires your enemies to do a saving throw. If it's a spell that requires you to do a spell attack roll, then you roll a d20 and you add your spell attack modifier. If the outcome is equal to or higher than the target's armor class, then you hit and you go ahead and do the damage. But if it's a type of spell which forces the enemy to do a saving throw, then they will make a saving throw, and on your character sheet you have your spell save DC. If their saving throw is equal to or higher than your spell save DC, then they succeed, but if it is less, then they fail. The description of the spell will say what happens either way. If you're casting a spell that has a lingering effect, then the duration will tell you how long that effect lasts. While talking about spells, it's a good time to talk about different damage types. Some spells and abilities might have damage types such as fire or acid, and although they don't have rules themselves, some other rules rely on these damage types. The main one being resistances and vulnerabilities. A creature might have a resistance to fire, for example, and that means that when they take any sort of fire damage, it is halved. But on the other hand, a creature might have vulnerability to fire, and that means that if they're taking any sort of fire damage, it is doubled. That is pretty much everything you need to know for combat, but I'm just going to go through some extra things that I didn't know where else to put them in the video, so I'm just going to throw them on the end here. The first of which is cover, so creatures can actually take cover, such as behind a tree or below a wall. And by doing this you get a bonus to your armor class, so if half of your body is covered, you get +2 to your armor class, but if 3/4 of your body is covered, then you get +5 to your armor class. If you have total cover, then you cannot be targeted. Another thing I wasn't sure where to put it was 2-weapon fighting, so you can actually fight with 2 different weapons, one in each hand, but both of the weapons have to have the light property, which will be next to their name in the equipment chart. You can also replace your attack action with either a grapple or a shove. In either case, the person initiating it has to do an athletics check to see if it succeeds, and then the person who is trying to get away from the grapple or the shove has to either do an athletics check or an acrobatics check, and it's up to them which one of those two they choose. If the athletics or acrobatics check of the creature which is being attacked is equal to or higher than the athletics check of the person doing the attacker, then they manage to dodge it and they don't get grappled or shoved. If a creature does get grappled, they can escape on their turn by using an athletics check or an acrobatics check, opposed by the person who's grappling them athletics check. Once again, if they get equal to or higher than the person who's trying to hold them down athletics check, then they succeed. There you go, that is pretty much everything you will need to know about combat in 5th edition's Dungeons & Dragons. The only things I haven't gone through are mounted combat and underwater combat, but the rules for them are in the player's handbook, and I didn't think I'd include them here because I'm pretty sure this is going to be a long video as it is. And generally the rules for them are pretty simple, so you should be able to work it out by just reading it from the player's handbook. I really hope this video has been helpful for you. If it has, make sure to give it a like. If you have any questions at all, put them down in the comments and I will make sure to get to them. If you want more help with your Dungeons & Dragons games, I upload videos here every Monday and Thursday, so make sure to subscribe to see more of those videos and hit the notification bell so you get notified when I upload a new video. But until next time, happy gaming!